Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me back. Clicker is not clicking. Okay. I've been talking maybe for the last couple years at this event about how so many standards are converging. So I thought I'd start with a little wrap-up of a brief history of that, particularly the convergence between EPUB and W3C web standards, which has been going on for quite some time. Started with a white paper that Ivan Herman and Marcus Gilling did at Books and Browsers in 2014, Bridging the Web and Digital Publishing. Started out being called EPUB Plus Web, and then it was EPUB Web. And by the way, one of the things we're talking about earlier is versioning and how standards evolve. So you can see there's a white paper that comes out, and there's an unofficial draft. Then it gets into GitHub, at which point it's called Portable Web Documents for the Open Web Platform. And that's how I've represented it the past, last year at this event. That came out in September last year. At that point, it was just a working draft in GitHub. In October, it was published as an official working draft by the W3C. And you may notice a subtle shift there, which I'll get into in a minute, because in GitHub it was called Portable Web Documents for Web Platform. And a month later, less than a month later, when it went on to the W3C working draft stage, Portable Web Publications for the Open Web Platform. And one that has a very recent date, 28 November, just a couple weeks ago, called Web Publications for the Open Web Platform. So you see how the name has changed over those 2 years. We had this amazing revelation that we need to first define what is a web publication before we get into portable web publication, because there really isn't such a thing. A publication is not the same as a document, although publication can include a whole bunch of documents, right? But a bunch of stuff on the web could, in fact, be a publication. So what that interest group is now working on is really focusing on what do we mean by a web publication, meaning, and I'll read you this, an arbitrarily extensive and complex collection, arbitrarily meaning it can just be one thing, right? But it can be arbitrarily large and complicated, collection of resources on the web, so we're talking about web pages, style sheets, fonts, images, media, scripts, etc. All that stuff has an identity, and it can be referenced, and whether it's packaged or how it's packaged is actually a separate issue. It's that thing, that publication, which, by the way, there is no usable identifier at the moment for what that thing is. So that's one thing we're struggling with. And another thing that's evolving in this conversation, this discussion, is that the meaning of the P in PWP is shifting from packaged to meaning portable, because in the circles I go in, the term packaged is a loaded word, because people will say, well, what do you mean by packaged? What kind of packaging, etc.? Is that really essential to what we mean by a publication? Answer is not really. It isn't. But it's not just about text. It's all that stuff. And this is STM's most recent infographic about Tech Trends Outlook 2020. I presume most of you or all of you have seen this thing, right? It's overwhelmingly complex. This is what this STM initiative has said is the state of our ecosystem right now. Pretty messy, pretty complicated. So publications have to accommodate all that kind of stuff. Data, for example, as we heard this morning. So give you a little bit of a sense of what's happening in just the specs that are part of what we mean by a web publication. Obviously, HTML is one of them. HTML 5.1 has just come out. 1st November, it became official. Not a big deal, mostly just kind of fine-tuning, aligning with how browsers and web pages actually work these days. There are some new elements. A couple that I think are interesting are the details element and the summary element. Those enable you to create content that the user can decide whether or not to read, whether to skip, etc. Some features were removed. Most of that's super technical. I don't need to get into it. Since I'm a markup guy, this is what I do for a living, the ability to use the figure caption anywhere within the figure is a really useful change to me, because it used to have to either be the first thing or the last thing, but it couldn't be anywhere else. So you see those are really nits, right? Not a big deal. And guess what? HTML 5.2 is already being worked on. Should be out late in 2017. So my main point here isn't really the details of this. It's just that this is an ongoing thing. And I was actually thinking about this in one of the comments that was made this morning about versioning, and that question of is it in JATS or not? Well, it's able to be expressed in JATS, as you saw, but no, there isn't an explicit thing about that. In other words, it uses the role attribute. So, one thing that people often complain about with standards is that they change too much. And the other thing they complain about is that they don't change fast enough, right? So that's a really good example. It's like, we want you to add that. Well, hold on, it's brand new. We'll get there. CSS is a kind of a different story, partly because CSS is a modular spec. So there's actually a lot happening in CSS land. And some of these are kind of techie, but these are things that actually are really, really important for publishing, because ultimately what publishers want is to be able, frankly, to do the kind of layouts and rendering that we can do in print, and that we've long been able to do in print, that we still really can't do with web technology. So people were skeptical of this digital publishing interest group. Was it actually going to do anything? Was it actually going to have any influence? Yes, absolutely. The CSS working group is really listening to what the publishing industry wants. So there's some new features for being able to execute complex layouts, features that allow content to be adaptable, and of course this is what keeps good layout and design able to reflow and to be able to be rendered on mobile screens as well as kind of a fixed dimension screen. That's extremely important. Some new features for font handling are coming up that are going to be very cool and kind of give you access to more direct control of a lot of glyphs and characters, particularly in scholarly and scientific publishing, that are very cumbersome to deal with now. Things are going to get a lot easier on that. And believe it or not, Microsoft is actually working on a new spec for table behavior in order to make tables interoperable between browsers. And the reason that's so important is that for W3C standards, or recommendations as they're officially called, they aren't considered final and official until there are at least 2 implementations. So it needs folks like Microsoft to actually do the thing before it'll actually be in a spec. So that's actually really, really promising. So all this stuff, basically my main message is these web standards are getting ever closer to being what true professional publishing really needs to have. And so obviously, when this PWP initiative, EPUB plus Web back in the day, was started, the vision was one publication for both online and offline use, so that we'll be able to have the same content, and it would simply exist in 2 different states. It would be offline, whether it's packaged or cached, and it would be online with all the essential pieces, resources linked, but they didn't necessarily have to live together, right, in an online environment. But it's the same thing. It's the same publication, and ideally it can have a canonical URL that says, this is that thing and here's where you find it, right? So that's where we're going with this. So this sounds like, and actually we're getting close. So this is not kind of pie in the sky, yeah, this is all theory, it's never going to happen. There's real concrete work happening. So we actually are getting to the point where we can envision a time where there really isn't any difference between an online publication and an EPUB. And so that's ultimately where we're trying to get. Well, people are starting to panic about this because they love their EPUBs. You know, remember, it was hard to convince people to use EPUB 3 because nobody was using it, wasn't implemented anywhere. Now everyone's dependent on EPUB 3 and says, don't change that. Well, don't panic. Nobody's saying we're going to take away EPUB. The idea is that EPUB is part of this larger environment on the web. And of course, that's what the initiative that's actually in the process of being worked out right now of combining IDPF into the W3C, which I'll get to a little bit later. But EPUB 3 absolutely has become an essential part of the publishing ecosystem, and it's not just about books. So yes, it's the master format that virtually all e-reading systems accept, even Kindle, because Amazon, notoriously not standards participant, even though they have their own proprietary format, the preferred input to Kindle Gen is an EPUB 3. So EPUB 3 kind of has become the lingua franca of e-readers. Accessibility, it is the format for the interchange of accessible content. It has supplanted the previous DAISY formats, and the DAISY consortium now basically recommends, I don't think they can mandate, EPUB 3 as the format in which to distribute content so that it's accessible. It's widely used in education. I think last year I mentioned the development of the EPUB for Education profile of EPUB. Complex educational content isn't often distributed to e-readers as an EPUB, but it's distributed to reading systems, learning management systems, virtual learning environments, VLEs, LMSs, and a lot of educational publishers are using this model for their infrastructure. So Pearson is using it, Macmillan Learning is using it, et cetera. So it's become really essentially embedded into the education space. VitalSource is a huge user of EPUB 3. And it's used for all kinds of publications, not just books, and it's widely adopted globally. This is not just an English language thing, it's not just US and EU, it's actually more widely embedded in some ways in the Far East. Japan, Korea, particularly, and China are big users of EPUB 3. So this is has become really an essential part of what our ecosystem is all about. Will there be an EPUB 4? Well, this standard, this model will continue to evolve. Ideally, what we've been trying to work on, as I've said for the past couple of years, is to converge these things so that ultimately it's all the same thing. What we really want to avoid is two competing specs. We don't want to have there be a web publication spec, one type of which might be a portable web publication, that's not the same as an EPUB. That would be just a disaster for the ecosystem because there'd be just so much confusion and so much conflict. But one thing I like to point out to people is that these specs can be what I like to think of as layered. More common way to think about it is profiles of a spec. So think of the fundamental spec being a web publication, WP. There can be a type of web publication that is portable, so that's a PWP. And there can be a type of portable web publication that's an EPUB. Well, why would you do that? It's because there's a reason that the web publication spec wants to be as accommodating as possible. Any kind of publication, and if it's packaged, for example, it should be able to use any kind of packaging that's available or that has not yet been invented, right? Well, the publication supply chain, on the other hand, wants predictability. So it wants a particular kind of packaging. So EPUB uses zip as the packaging. It likes to have a particular kind of way of organizing the content, a way of expressing the metadata, et cetera. not just any way that's possible using web technology. So it's a subset of that larger, more accommodating spec, but it's still a web publication. It's just a particular kind of one called an EPUB. So that's where I think we're going. I will say that I've been advocating this for a year or two. There are those that agree with me, there are those that disagree with me. So this is not a decided thing yet, but that's where I think we're going to wind up with. So, and just like EPUB for Education is a profile of EPUB. Anything that meets that EPUB for Education spec is in fact a valid EPUB, but it's just more restrictive. For example, it has some metadata requirements that are optional in EPUB. They're required in EPUB for Education. That's the whole reason why we're working on this combination of IDPF into W3C. It's not a done deal yet. Membership of both organizations has voted overwhelmingly in support of it, but now all the legal work, it has to be done. We're thinking ideally it'll get done early in 2017. And so here's the plan, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about this too, because a lot of people are worried that the publishing industry is going to suddenly lose its voice because there won't be any IDPF left. The intention is exactly the opposite, is to provide the publishing industry input into the web development process that's governed by the W3C. So the plan is that there will be a publishing business group formed. That's going to be a formal voice for publishing in the W3C, which has been lacking until this digital publishing interest group had been formed a couple years ago. And just to get to some of the practical details that people are worried about, the dues to belong to that publishing business group, and this is a standard business group, that's a standard structure within W3C, the dues are very comparable to IDPF dues. So it's not the same as full membership in the W3C, which is quite expensive. In fact, when you actually look at the dues schedules side by side, there are some sizes of companies where their dues actually would go down rather than up by being part of this publishing business group. And the deal is, if the deal goes through as we're working toward making it happen, current IDPF members in good standing as of this year, so if you're a member and you haven't paid your dues yet, pay them quick, because the time is running out, because you will then be grandfathered in, you'll automatically be a member. All IDPF members will automatically be a member of the publishing business group at the current IDPF dues that they pay for 2 years. At that point, they can elect to stay in and pay what are then the standard W3C business group dues, which are probably for almost all of them about the same. Or they could join the W3C as full members. The business group will have advisory capabilities, but the business group, to be on one of the actual working groups that develops, say, the HTML standard, the CSS standard, the SVG standard, maybe someone will even do some work on MathML one of these days, you have to be a W3C member to be on a working group, but those working groups pay a lot of attention to the business groups, because the business groups are the ones that say, this is what our industry needs from you. That's why the CSS working group is talking to the publishing interest group to find out, you care about how things hyphenate, you care about line breaks, you care about spacing, you care about margins. It's like, hello, yes, we care about those things. Oh, okay, well, I guess we got to deal with that. And they're very cooperative about this. So there will be, well, I can't say will, I'll get to why I can't say will in a minute, a publishing working group that will actually develop standards. Probably that's what would create what would be EPUB 4, PWP, WP, et cetera. Why I say that I can't say that it will be created is that W3C has what's called the process. I think it has a capital P, I'm pretty sure. The process means that a proposal has to come in, a charter has to get developed, Tim Berners-Lee has to bless it. It isn't a working group until Tim Berners-Lee says it is, basically. So there are benevolent monarchies still in existence in the world, and this is one of them. I can tell you he has our interest at heart. People are skeptical. He spoke at an IDPF thing in Chicago at BEA last spring, and went on about, Internet of Things and being able to see things on billboards, and the publishers were freaking out, thinking, oh, this guy thinks that what publishing is? It's like, no, he was a scientist. Remember where the web came from? It was from scientific papers at CERN, right? That's where the web was born. So their heart is in doing this right. But the main thing that people overlook is that there will also be an EPUB 3 community group to maintain EPUB 3. EPUB 3 isn't being handed over because there's different IP policies between the IDPF and the W3C, so there has to be this kind of dividing line. So EPUB 3 is going to be maintained by a community group, and guess what the dues are for a community group? 0. It costs nothing to belong to a community group. So those whose most desperate wish is to preserve EPUB 3, they can do it, and they can participate at no cost. So I think it's a very good plan. But as I mentioned, there are folks that are afraid publishers are going to be lost. The plan is really to make sure that publishers have an even greater presence and influence, and that they can participate at costs that even small publishers can accommodate. So that's my commercial for the combination at this point. But in the meantime, EPUB 3 is continuing to advance. So let me update you on EPUB 3.1. Again, I would say a cautious update. Tightens up some things about EPUB 3. Much improved spec format that is much better integrated. It deprecates some features of EPUB 3.0 that were never used. So we're getting them out of there. It's clarifying and extending support for remote resources. And there's one, I think it's on my next slide. Yes. I won't tell you now because I'll wait till I get to that slide. Support for remote resources like metadata, fonts, data sets, etc. Very relevant to SDM. Improved CSS behavior, better accessibility support, stricter accessibility support. And we have an IDPF board meeting day after tomorrow where the board is almost sure to put this, it's gone through the whole IP review process and all the requisite drafts and public reviews, et cetera. So it's now final and ready for a final vote, and the board will probably on Thursday start the clock ticking for that final vote. So EPUB 3.1 is all but official. Better alignment with the Open Web Platform. One thing that's interesting is that previous versions of EPUB referred to specific versions of HTML that it conformed to. We eliminated that and are now using undated references. And this gets to the topic of versioning that we were talking about this morning, because what that means is that the EPUB spec will refer to whatever is the then current HTML spec as the model for the content document markup. Same with SVG. It's also eliminating the CSS profile that's been in EPUB in favor of kind of the standard official definition that comes from the CSS working group. And then some metadata improvements. One I think is really interesting, that you've always been able to, I was going to say put a metadata record in an EPUB. What that actually means is associate a metadata record with an EPUB. So you could put an ONIX record or a MARC record inside an EPUB. Or you can link to it from the EPUB. But the previous definition always said if there's a conflict between that external metadata and the metadata that's in the metadata that's in the EPUB wins. We've just flipped that. So EPUB 3.1 says, no, it's that external metadata record always is the governing one if there's a conflict with metadata in the EPUB. And the reason for that is that the metadata, the external metadata has an ability to evolve. Things happen, things get changed. Some things don't change. Title probably doesn't change, et cetera. But, so anyway, you get the point. I'm going to click through quickly just a final thing on EPUB to really reinforce that it's not just a book format. Some interesting new things. You may not have heard this because this is still in beta. is that Microsoft Edge, the current generation of the Microsoft browser, is now incorporating EPUB Reader natively in Microsoft Edge. So you'll be able to just open an ebook the way you can open a PDF in your browser. It's here today. You can test it. You may not have heard of Woodwing, but Woodwing is kind of the content development and production system that's overwhelmingly used to create magazines. And it's always been based on proprietary formats, Flash, etc. They have now brought out an HTML5 version so that the latest version of that software is now based entirely on the open web platform. I mentioned VitalSource before. Their system is built to ingest EPUB 3s. They've now introduced a content creation platform. It's basically a cloud-based creation tool to create EPUBs, complex educational content with all kinds of multimedia, quizzes, tests, etc. And it automatically creates an EPUB 3, and it guides you to create an accessible EPUB 3. And that's here today. And lastly, IBM has moved from PDF to EPUB as the format for all of its publications. So that's really an important endorsement as well. And it's because it reflows. It works in a mobile environment in a way that PDF doesn't. Okay, so that's the PWP, WP, EPUB part of the program. Next part that will be a little quicker is accessibility, but this is really an important thing because while a lot of the work is part of EPUB, it's really bigger than EPUB. So at the same time that the EPUB 3.1 spec is coming out, EPUB Accessibility 1.0 is coming out. The reason that we pulled all the accessibility stuff out is so that it can be separately referenceable by anybody. So it's referenceable by any version of EPUB as EPUB continues to evolve, but it's also referenceable for other purposes. So for example, a lot of funding agencies put as a requirement in the grant that the publication has to be accessible, but they have not had the ability to say, what does that mean? What do you have to do to make it accessible? The idea is you can now point to this spec and say, that's what it means. It's called the baseline for accessibility. I guess I won't get into the details here, but it finally provides a foundation for certification that an EPUB is, in fact, is properly accessible. And there are systems being worked on right now. Benetech is working in conjunction with DAISY to develop a certification process and basically a certification badge, if you will, that we expect to have finished by the first of the year. So that, because this is really important, particularly in the university context, for procurement offices that need to know that they may mandate that content acquired for the university for classroom use has to be accessible. This will be a way for them to, specify what they mean by accessible, and to know that that a particular publication has been certified as accessible. Another interesting thing, it's interesting to me because I love this geeky stuff, but this is a kind of a metadata crowd, is it establishes 3 different levels of compliance. So discovery enabled means it at least has metadata discussing the accessibility features of this publication. Accessible means that it has that metadata, plus it's compliant with WCAG 2.0, which is web accessibility standard, plus some additional requirements that EPUB has added on to WCAG. And then a third one, which I think is really interesting, is optimized, which means it's not actually fully accessible. In other words, it doesn't have all the accessibility features, but it's optimized, say, for visually impaired people. So, or it's optimized for deaf people. So you don't need alt text for images for deaf people, right? They can see the images. So there are other features that make an EPUB accessible to a deaf person. So it's legitimate to say, or Braille is a perfect example, because it doesn't do any of the other stuff that's required, but it's Braille. So, and then the metadata that's built into the EPUB accessibility spec has been coordinated with schema.org so that the exact same schema.org vocabulary is used in both contexts. And it's got access mode, which is is this accessible by textual mode, visual mode, auditory, or tactile? A way to list what the accessibility features are. Ability to put in a warning of an accessibility hazard. Flashing, for example, can cause seizures in some people. A human readable summary, and then something that says access mode sufficient. So for example, if you've got text plus alt text for images, then textual mode is sufficient for that publication. Now, a couple of last topics. I mentioned last year the work on annotations. That work has continued and has come actually a long way, is almost to the finish line. So in the W3C world, Web Annotation Working Group actually is publishing 3 different recommendations: a data model, a vocabulary, and protocol. And what this does is it provides data structures that make annotations interoperable. So this is really, really valuable for scholarly publishing. It enables annotations to be exchanged between systems. You can store them on a server. You can put annotations in text, on images, on videos, etc. And again, this is in the very final approval stages. Probably all 3 of these will be official by February. So I think that's something that you will absolutely be making use of in the future. Another thing that I mentioned last year, coincidentally, this Annotating All Knowledge initiative, the embargo on it was lifted the day that I was giving this talk last year. So you were some of the first people in the world to hear about this project. But of course, it's like, yeah, is that actually going to go anywhere? Is that actually going to do anything? Well, yes. There's over 70 scholarly publishers, platforms, libraries, technology organizations, big ones that you all know and love. Some that you hate because they're your competitors are in this group. JSTOR's in it, Crossref's in it, etc. Lots and lots of the main players in the STM community are part of this coalition. And basically, it's developing open source standards and formats based on HTML, PDF, which is not one of the web standards, EPUB, images, video, and data, to really make this vision of interoperable annotations that the W3 spec recommendations provide, make it actual reality and have people actually using it. And so they've got a very ambitious timeline, a 3-year timeline, and there's pilots going on right now at JSTOR, at Archive, at eLife, etc. I hope you guys are aware of this. Good. Because obviously what we want is for this to be real, and it is. The Force 11 is hosting a community platform and a working group. So this 3-year timeline is, the first year is kind of the design and build stage, experimenting, gathering requirements, and actually shipping the standards and software this coming year. Second year, deployment, so making it available with articles, books, other media objects, and the 3rd year, marketing. And here's one that you probably haven't heard of that I think is really interesting. It doesn't come out of the scholarly, it comes out of a corner or a side of the scholarly publishing world, which is the cultural heritage side of the world, is what it's formally called, about images that I think is really neat. Interoperable images. It's called the International Image Interoperability Framework. They have the narrowest URL in existence, iiif.io. They win the prize for the tiniest URL. This started out about 2 years ago with about 25 organizations, mostly libraries and museums, cultural heritage organizations. It's now got over 600 libraries, mostly national libraries, France, England, US, etc., research institutions, museums, technology firms, aggregators, various other projects. So it's a community. Their purpose is to actually create APIs, which I'll get into in the next slide, and actually build interoperable services around this. And this is all about making images interoperable. And I am actually going to be doing a session at SSP this summer, in June, I guess end of May, beginning of June. with both Annotating All Knowledge and IIIF talking about these projects, because I think they're really interesting. And for scholarly publishers, images are really important. Think medical publishing, for heaven's sake. Critically important. So the image API, is basically handles the identification of an image, expressing regions within images, expressing size, mirroring of images, rotating images, associating rights with them, creating multiple versions of them, etc. The presentation API has structure, properties like labels, technical information, links, etc. And you can associate transcriptions, translations, commentaries, etc., not just with an image as a whole, but with regions of an image. So you can imagine in a learning context, for example, how important that can be. And keep in mind, this is all done in an interoperable way, not dependent on any particular system, not proprietary. And then they're going to be working on audio and video and 3D in the future. And all of these things are all based on web technologies, including the annotation spec that's just about to be final. And that's it. I was supposed to finish by 2:30. I have 2 minutes, so I told Tasha I was going to try to beat the clock. I did. First time ever. And these are all the links to things I talked about.